Hey dear Timeless Sleep community, tonight, imagine the glow of lanterns bouncing against the polished stone of Athens, narrow alleys carrying the scent of oil lamps and roasted chickpeas. The streets hum faintly with sandals scraping over marble, voices of merchants haggling over figs, and the occasional clatter of a drinking cup slipping from someone's hand after too much diluted wine. You pause near a door carved with simple symbols, not elaborate palaces, just the modest front of a citizen's home. Inside, the air is warm with smoke and sweat, but beneath the comfort of hearth fire something heavier lingers, the quiet, unspoken presence of those who keep the place running, but are never truly seen. You'd probably never make it through a single ancient Greek night, but don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So, before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. Slavery in Greece wasn't a footnote, it was the invisible machinery of the entire society. Walk into an Athenian silver mine at Lorraine, and you'd immediately smell damp earth mixed with a sharp tang of crushed ore. Hundreds of enslaved men and boys bent double in tunnels barely taller than a crouch, scraping at rock with iron picks, torches hissing and sputtering, while the air thinned until lungs felt like they were breathing through cloth. Chains clinked softly, not always on ankles, sometimes on the tools themselves, tethering miners to their work like stubborn pets. Athens built its democracy on the backs of these workers, a paradox worthy of Socratic irony. Citizens voted in the agora while hundreds below ground hacked silver from the earth to mint the coins that paid for ships, festivals, and the glorious Parthenon. Freedom for some, suffocating tunnels for others. The Greeks would have called it balance. You might call it creative hypocrisy. And the danger was constant. The tunnels weren't lined with tidy beams like in a Minecraft build. They collapsed suddenly, sealing men in stone coffins before their names were even learned. Imagine labouring for years, never once glimpsing daylight except when dragged up to collapse beside heaps of discarded bodies. If you tried to run, the punishment was immediate: branding, flogging, or a slow death chained upright as an example. It makes your workplace coffee machine complaints feel charmingly quaint, doesn't it? Above ground, slavery looked more polished but no less peculiar. In wealthy homes, enslaved women spun wool, tended children, and managed the cooking. Fires that never slept. Some were treated almost like members of the family entrusted with household accounts, or even teaching children their letters. But don't let that trick you into imagining comfort. Affection could vanish with a single command. A servant could be sold tomorrow like a pair of sandals, no farewell hugs required. In Athens, one particularly odd quirk existed. Enslaved people could sometimes buy their freedom if they scraped together enough earnings, often through side arrangements. Picture a man negotiating with his master like some bizarre loyalty program. If I save up 3 more years of tips from polishing your sandals, do I win my independence badge? Occasionally, these freed individuals became successful artisans or merchants. It's history's early version of climbing the corporate ladder, except the bottom rung was an iron collar. Now slip over to Sparta, where slavery wore a different face. The helots weren't imported individuals, but an entire conquered population. Imagine waking up every day knowing your whole ethnicity had been filed under permanent labour force. They farmed the land, provided the food, and silently sustained the Spartan war machine. But the Spartans, terrified of rebellion, invented the Krypteia, a youth program where teenage boys stalked and killed helots under cover of night. Call it a twisted internship. Instead of fetching coffee, you practiced murder to keep society in check. The tension ran like a taut string. The helots outnumbered their Spartan overlords many times over, and every festival, every gathering carried the quiet risk of revolt. Spartans dined on meat, sang songs of glory, and every so often sent squads of young men into the dark to remind the helots who held the knife. It was fear disguised as tradition, paranoia masquerading as statecraft. Picture living in a gated community where the homeowners association rules included random assassination of the gardeners allowed. Comforting? not so much. Oddly, some Greeks defended slavery as a natural condition. Philosophers like Aristotle argued that some people were slaves by nature, born to serve like donkeys, born to carry loads. It sounds shocking, but in the context of the time, it was considered rational. Aristotle probably never had to clean someone else's chamber pot, or he might have revised that theory. The logic was neat on parchment, less so when you were knee-deep in someone else's laundry water. Even in daily city life, the traces of this system peek through. Take the marketplace. You wander between stalls selling olives, figs, and fresh fish. Behind each merchant is likely an enslaved assistant carrying baskets, weighing goods, or running errands. Want a loaf of bread? An enslaved baker kneaded the dough. Need your sandals mended? An enslaved craftsman stitched the leather. Athens glittered with public debates, statues, and theatre, but almost every brick, stitch, and coin carried the fingerprints of people who never got applause. And then there were the cruel ironies. Slaves couldn't testify in court unless tortured, since Greeks believed only pain guaranteed truth. Imagine your boss saying, "We'll only take your testimony seriously if we hit you with sticks first." It wasn't satire, it was law. Torture chambers in Athens weren't shadowy dungeons. They were legal tools, accepted parts of civic procedure. Nothing like democracy with a side of legalized sadism to spice up your afternoon assembly. Sometimes enslaved people were used for entertainment. At symposia, those famous drinking parties, you'd see them pouring wine, playing flutes, or even being mocked as part of the evening's amusement. Guests reclined on couches, laughing at jokes made at the expense of the very people serving them. A kind of ancient version of karaoke, where the microphone was chained to your wrist and you weren't allowed to leave the stage. But here's the strangest twist. Despite their dependence on slaves, some Greeks feared them enough to imagine a future uprising. Plays and comedies occasionally poked fun at slaves outsmarting their masters, a nervous kind of humour that revealed a cultural worry. It's the same uneasy chuckle you give when someone jokes about your internet password being stolen. You laugh, but a tiny part of you changes it that night. For the Spartans, this fear was more than hypothetical. Every harvest brought whispers of helots planning rebellion. Whole villages were kept under surveillance, and Spartan festivals included rituals reminding everyone of their place. The Cryptia wasn't just training, it was annual therapy for Spartan paranoia, a reassurance that the whip still snapped and the sword still gleamed. Now imagine yourself stepping out of a Spartan farmstead at dusk. The fields smell of cut grain and animal sweat. In the distance you see helots trudging home, faces lowered, backs bent. Above them, Spartan youths sharpen knives, preparing to slip into the night. The entire society feels balanced on a knife edge, bread baked by fear, wine pressed from dread. And yet, oddly, this strange brutal system helped forge the Greece we remember. The plays of Sophocles, the questions of Socrates, the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae. Every cultural triumph carried the shadow of enslaved labour. It's unsettling to picture the Parthenon's marble glow, while knowing whose hands hauled those stones uphill. Still, Greeks wrapped their contradictions in poetry and philosophy. To them the cosmos was ordered, with free citizens destined for politics and war, slaves destined for labour, and gods destined for meddling. It all made sense, at least until you looked too closely. Then you saw the cracks, the chains, the faces fading into anonymity. Strange, isn't it? A civilization that gave us democracy also perfected the art of silent oppression. You can almost hear the echo. The cheers in the agora layered over the coughs of miners underground, laughter at symposia drowning out the tired shuffle of bare feet in kitchens and fields. So tonight, as the lanterns dim in your mind, picture Athens not just as marble temples and debates under blue skies, but also as a city humming with hidden labour. Hear the clatter of chains under the music, the scrape of picks beneath the theatre's applause. That was Greece too, bright brilliance glowing against a darker backdrop. The air in Sparta tastes different than in Athens. You feel it as you walk across the hard-packed earth, dust clinging to your sandals, the smell of leather shields and boiled barley drifting from nearby kitchens. In the distance, boys' voices rise not with laughter, but with sharp yelps, the sound of training. Spears thump against wooden posts, the rhythm as steady as a war drum. Sparta wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed like a military barrack stretched into a city. And tonight, You're about to see one of its strangest institutions, the Crypteia, Sparta's secret shadow school where teenagers became predators under the guise of civic duty. The Crypteia was both simple and horrifying. Each year, Spartan officials selected young men, often around 18 or 20, and gave them a grim assignment. By day they would train as usual, but at night they would vanish into the countryside armed only with daggers and ordered to stalk the Helots, Sparta's enslaved population. The objective? Instill fear. Cull anyone who seemed too bold or strong, and prove their own courage by surviving alone in the wilderness. Imagine summer camp, except instead of roasting marshmallows, you were expected to murder your neighbours and report back with a straight face. You tread softly, imagining what it felt like for one of those boys. The moonlight cuts across the fields. You crouch low, dagger pressed against your thigh, the chirp of crickets disguising your breath. Ahead, you see shadows of helots returning from the fields carrying heavy baskets of barley. Your instructions are clear. Watch them, intimidate them, and if one looks too defiant, silence him. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic. The Spartan state officially declared war on the helots every year so that killing them wouldn't technically count as murder. Bureaucracy has rarely been so chilling. And yet, to a Spartan youth, the Crypteia wasn't horror. It was honour. Surviving nights in the wild with little food, relying on cunning, and committing sanctioned violence were steps toward full citizenship. This ritual blurred the line between law enforcement and teenage hazing, except failure meant death. You can almost picture a boy returning after a week of stalking, eyes bloodshot, stomach gnawing with hunger, holding out a token, a stolen piece of barley bread or the story of a helot silenced. Proof he was ready to be a Spartan warrior. Why did Sparta cling to this bizarre system? Fear. The helots outnumbered citizens by 5, maybe even 10 to 1. The thought of rebellion gnawed constantly at the Spartan mind. Imagine living in a house where every servant secretly outnumbered you. You might start checking your locks a little more obsessively too. The Crypteia was less about killing individuals and more about psychological domination, reminding the helots that any night could bring a knife at the throat. It's tempting to shake your head at this paranoia, but part of you might also admire the twisted logic. Sparta engineered fear the way modern states engineer tax codes, with consistency, thoroughness, and a touch of paperwork. And somehow it worked. For centuries the helots remained subdued, their labour feeding the war machine that marched across Greece. But consider the cost. Spartan boys were raised not with lullabies or bedtime stories, but with whispers about their duty to stalk shadows. Childhood games blurred into rehearsals for violence. If you think your teen years were awkward, imagine yours including a state-sponsored midnight stabbing club. Acne would feel like the least of your problems. The Crypteia also stripped away softness. Sleeping in fields, drinking stream water, and enduring hunger hardened the body and mind. Spartans admired toughness to the point of absurdity. Mothers were said to give sons shields with the phrase, "come back with it," or "on it." That's ancient Greek for, win, or you're grounded permanently. Picture one of those mothers waiting at the hearth, oil lamp flickering, listening for her son's footsteps after a week away. She doesn't expect him to come home cheerful. She expects him to come home silent, carrying the weight of what he's done. Affection was measured not in embraces but in proof of endurance. That's a family dynamic guaranteed to make even Thanksgiving dinners feel like war councils. What makes the Crypteia especially strange is that it wasn't just about killing. It was about invisibility. A youth who made himself too obvious failed. Success meant becoming a rumour in the fields, a whisper in the dark. To Spartans, the perfect warrior wasn't just strong. He was unseen until the final strike. The Crypteia wasn't only training killers, it was training phantoms. There are echoes of this in later military traditions, Roman scouts, medieval assassins, even modern special forces. But Sparta tied it not to elite units, but to civic adulthood. If you wanted to vote, if you wanted to call yourself a full citizen, you first had to vanish into the night and return changed. Democracy by dagger, not exactly the kind of campaign slogan you'd want on a bumper sticker. And the helots? Imagine living under this system. You're bent over in the fields, sweat dripping, and you sense eyes in the dark. Do you straighten your back too boldly? Do you whisper too, loudly to your neighbour? That small flicker of defiance might be the difference between surviving the night or being found in the ditch at dawn. Fear became fertilizer in Spartan soil, growing obedience with every harvest. There were rebellions, of course. Sometimes helots rose up, especially when Sparta faltered in war. But each time the Spartans crushed them ruthlessly, renewing the cycle. The crypteia wasn't foolproof. It was maintenance, like sharpening a blade, and the Spartans sharpened constantly. As you walk deeper into this imagined night, notice how the silence grows heavy. You think of the young boys stalking and the helots trembling, and you realize both sides were trapped. One enslaved by labor, the other enslaved by fear of losing control. The cruelty of the crypteia wasn't just in the killings, it was in binding an entire society to paranoia. The helots could never relax, and the Spartans could never stop watching. Everyone's nerves stayed frayed, like a bowstring pulled tight and left to quiver forever. It almost makes you wonder, who were the real prisoners here? The helots bound to farms, or the Spartans bound to sleepless suspicion? You wouldn't envy either side, though if you had to pick, you'd probably prefer being a helot. At least you could complain about back pain without being told it was character building. Still, the crypteia achieved its goal, creating warriors who feared nothing except weakness. By the time a Spartan youth finished this ritual, he was steel inside and out. But the price was humanity. Empathy became collateral damage, smothered by duty. If you've ever been accused of lacking empathy after ignoring a text, console yourself. At least you didn't have to prove it with a state-issued dagger. As dawn breaks over the hills in your mind, the boys return, stepping into the city with hollow eyes. They rejoin their peers, sit at communal meals and speak little. No one asks for details, everyone knows. Their silence says enough. Around them Sparta hums along, helots working, citizens training, mothers sewing, the system grinding forward like a wheel that refuses to stop. And you, still standing at the edge of those fields, feel the strange shiver of it all. A civilization that worshipped strength, engineered fear, and trained its youth not by stories but by shadows. It's unsettling, it's bizarre, and it's very, very Greek. The hearth smoke in Sparta curls upward, carrying the smell of boiled barley, goat cheese, and sweat-soaked cloaks. You push open the wooden door of a dim house, expecting perhaps the warmth of a family dinner. Instead, you find something stranger, a marriage ceremony that looks suspiciously like a prank gone wrong. The bride, freshly shorn of her long hair, stands stiffly. Her head is shaved close to the scalp, and she wears not flowing gowns but a rough wool tunic like a soldier's. If you squint, you might think she was just another recruit who wandered into the wrong ritual. This was Sparta's version of matrimony, where symbolism wore sharper edges than in other Greek cities. Before consummation, the bride was disguised as a boy. The reasoning? Spartan men, having spent nearly all their youth surrounded exclusively by other males in barracks, supposedly needed a transition phase to approach women without panic. Nothing says romance like your new wife cosplaying as your bunkmate. You sit cross-legged, watching the flickering oil lamps throw shadows on the walls. The groom, hardened by years of training, doesn't approach his wife with roses or tender vows. Instead, he slips into the room secretly at night, often after dining with his male companions, and only briefly lies with her before returning to his barracks. This pattern continued even after marriage. Spartan husbands often spent more time sleeping beside fellow soldiers than beside their wives. It's the ancient version of, "Sorry honey, guy's night never ends." The hair-cutting ritual itself had layers of meaning. Hair was a marker of femininity in Greek culture, so stripping it away symbolized transformation. The woman was no longer a girl but entering a new role. Yet here the role wasn't nurturer or partner, but something halfway toward warrior. Scholars debate whether this custom was about easing men into heterosexual marriage, or about equating the wife with the masculine ideals Sparta so adored. Either way, the effect was jarring. Weddings that looked less like unions of love, and more like strategic mergers disguised as costume parties. The oddness didn't stop there. In some cases, Spartan wives were expected to share themselves if the state demanded more children. If a husband was older, infertile, or frequently away at war, arrangements could be made for a younger, stronger man to impregnate the wife. Consent. Well, let's just say it was treated more like a city ordinance than a heartfelt conversation. The goal wasn't personal happiness, but population control, ensuring a steady supply of strong Spartan warriors. Romantic candlelit dinners didn't make it into the constitution, but reproduction quotas practically did. Imagine the dinner table conversation. "Darling, the council thinks my friend Nicandros here should, well, contribute. Don't take it personally, it's for Sparta." Awkward silence, followed by another spoonful of barley broth. Modern couples argue over where to vacation. Spartans argued over who'd father the next civic soldier. This system blurred boundaries of fidelity in ways that scandalized other Greeks. Athenians whispered that Spartans had turned marriage into little more than a breeding program. To the Spartans, however, loyalty to the city outweighed loyalty to the bedroom. Your spouse's fidelity wasn't measured by affection, but by her ability to produce citizens. Think of it as the state crashing your honeymoon. Sweet, clipboard in hand, ticking boxes for population targets met women in Sparta, though had more agency than in most Greek city-states. While their hair might be shorn on their wedding day, their lives afterward held unusual freedoms. They owned property, managed estates while husbands were at war, and even engaged in athletic training. A Spartan woman could stride into the marketplace with confidence, unlike Athenian wives cloistered indoors. So while the wedding night may have resembled a bizarre costume party, the years that followed offered a paradoxical mix of subjugation and independence. Still, the intimacy of marriage was filtered through Sparta's obsession with military discipline. Husbands sneaked into their wives' quarters at night, sometimes for years, to maintain the illusion that their first loyalty was to their fellow soldiers. Even after producing children, the relationship could feel fragmented, like two actors sharing a stage only briefly before retreating to different plays. If Tinder had existed then, Spartan profiles might have read, "Loyal to my comrades first, wife second." Swipe right if you like short haircuts. Other Greeks viewed these customs with raised eyebrows. In Athens, weddings were colourful affairs with banquets, songs and rituals celebrating the bride's fertility. In Corinth, wealthy families flaunted dowries and processionals. Sparta, by contrast, shaved heads and whispered vows in the dark. To outsiders, it seemed stark, even humourless. To Spartans, it was practical. Marriage wasn't about spectacle, it was about continuity. One particularly unusual practice was the idea of polyandry, rare in the ancient world, but occasionally referenced in Spartan context. Some accounts suggest that a woman might be married to one man but also bear children by his brothers, keeping property within the family and maximising healthy offspring. If you thought family reunions were complicated, try keeping track of siblings who double as co-fathers. Imagine introducing your child. This is your father, and your other father, and possibly your uncle. Don't worry about the labels, just remember we all serve Sparta. Despite the utilitarian design, Spartan marriages weren't devoid of emotion. Some couples did develop affection, though quietly. A husband sneaking through the dark to his wife's room might have felt a thrill of intimacy, precisely because it was forbidden during the day. Secrecy can heighten bonds, even when arranged by civic decree. Perhaps those brief encounters, whispered behind doors, offered glimmers of genuine tenderness in a society that rarely allowed softness. Yet the system also placed enormous pressure on women. Producing strong sons was their primary duty, and failure could mean disgrace. A barren wife might be replaced or humiliated. The entire weight of Sparta's survival seemed to rest on her womb, a burden both empowering and crushing. If modern, motivational posters say, "You can do anything." Spartan mottos might have said, "You must do this one thing, or else." From a distance, the whole institution looks bizarre, but within Sparta it fits seamlessly into their worldview. Marriage wasn't personal fulfillment, it was military logistics. Haircuts, secret trysts, and loaned husbands were all part of keeping the phalanx full. For Spartans, love was less important than loyalty, and fidelity meant service to the state. As you leave that Spartan house in your mind, the smoke still clinging to your cloak, you realise how strange it feels. Weddings today are celebrations filled with laughter, tears, and maybe some questionable dancing. In Sparta, they were quiet contracts sealed in shadow. The bride's shaved head glints in the lamplight as she waits, not for affection, but for duty to walk through the door. It's unsettling, but also uniquely human, the way societies bend intimacy to fit their needs. The Spartans didn't abolish love, they simply redirected it, away from personal bonds and toward the collective. To them, romance was a luxury, but survival was law, and so marriage became not the joining of two souls, but the welding of citizens into Sparta's steel machine. The night air outside Sparta feels sharp, almost metallic, as though it carries the echo of shields clashing in the distance. You follow a narrow dirt path out of the city, past huts where smoke curls from cooking fires, and into the open countryside. It's quiet here, but the silence hides something darker. Along the hillsides, under the pale glow of moonlight, you spot small bundles lying abandoned, bundles that are not stones, not offerings, but infants. This was the custom of exposure, a practice not unique to Sparta, but perfected there with an almost chilling efficiency. In much of ancient Greece, a newborn's fate wasn't sealed at birth. Instead, the child was presented to the head of the household, usually the father or, in Sparta's case, the council of elders. They inspected the baby's body carefully, scrutinizing its limbs, chest, and even the way it cried. A healthy cry meant lungs strong enough for war someday. A feeble squeak might earn only a silent nod and a trip to the hillside. Imagine standing there, wrapped in swaddling cloth, your survival judged by the wrinkles of old men leaning on walking sticks. No test scores, no grades, just a brutal yes or no whispered over your tiny body. If you were deemed weak, deformed, or simply inconvenient, you'd be carried out beyond the city walls and placed on the rocky ground, left to the elements. The wind became your lullaby, the cold earth your cradle. This wasn't murder in their eyes, at least not exactly. To the Greeks, it was a form of population control, a way of ensuring that only the strongest survived to adulthood. Sparta took it further, moulding the practice into civic policy. Citizens didn't want weaklings draining resources, they wanted warriors. A child unable to carry a shield someday was treated as liability. Better to end it now, the elders reasoned, than waste grain later. A terrible calculus, but one they believed essential. And yet, exposure wasn't always the end. In some regions, abandoned infants were sometimes rescued by strangers. A poor farmer might take in a child as a servant, or a wealthy household might raise one as a slave. In rare cases, the baby could even grow up free, though always marked by the stigma of having been unwanted once. Imagine discovering that your entire existence hinged on whether a stranger happened to walk by your hillside at dawn. Life is a lottery ticket. That was Greek infancy. The cruelty of exposure had a strange logic. For societies constantly at war, survival was everything. Resources were scarce, and cities needed strong bodies to till the land, row ships, and stand in the phalanx. In their eyes, abandoning a weak child was not heartless but pragmatic. To them, you weren't eliminating a life. You were protecting the lives of the many. Of course, standing there with modern sensibilities, you feel the ache of how cold that reasoning must have felt. Pragmatism wears a chilling mask when you apply it to cradles. Sparta's version added ritual weight. According to some accounts, babies were brought before a council that made the final judgment. If approved, the child was returned to the family and raised for the agog, the state's rigorous training program. If not, the baby was carried to the apothetai, a chasm or hillside near Mount Taygetus, and left. The very geography of Sparta became entwined with this grim custom. Mountains weren't just natural barriers, they were graveyards for the rejected. Picture the scene. A mother clutching her newborn, hoping the tiny fists clenched with enough vigour to please the elders. Her heart races as they prod the baby, muttering about muscle tone or chest breadth. Then comes the nod, the decision. If favourable, relief floods her body. If not, grief must be smothered, for to protest was to challenge the city itself. In a society where obedience was sacred, even maternal instinct was expected to bow to civic duty. Athens, by contrast, handled exposure more privately. A father could simply decide not to raise a child and place it outside near a trash heap or on a hillside. Sometimes religious rituals softened the act, offerings left with the infant, prayers whispered to gods like Hermes or Hecate. The message was clear. We release this child to fate, to the gods, to chance. It was abandonment dressed up as ritual, cruelty tied with a bow of piety. Not every infant was exposed for weakness. Poverty played a role too. Families too poor to feed another mouth might leave a child in hopes that someone wealthier would take them in. Gender bias appeared as well. Female infants were more often abandoned, seen as less valuable than sons who could fight or inherit land. So a hillside could fill with baby girls, tiny bodies left not because they were weak, but because they were inconvenient. It's hard to call that pragmatism without your voice catching on the word. And yet, the stories of survival linger. Some infants were indeed rescued, later rising to remarkable roles. Ancient tales tell of exposed babies who grew to be heroes, kings, or founders of cities. Exposure became woven into myth. Oedipus famously was left on a mountainside with pierced ankles, only to be rescued and grow into tragic destiny. The myths romanticized what, in reality, was bleak and brutal. It's easier to tell yourself that abandoned children might someday be kings than to dwell on how many never lived past dawn. Still, the Greeks accepted exposure as natural. To them, the gods themselves had practiced it. Zeus, the king of gods, was hidden in a cave as an infant to escape his father's wrath. The divine mirrored the mortal, giving exposure a kind of cosmic precedent. When myths endorse cruelty, it becomes easier for societies to rationalize it. For mothers, the pain must have been immense, even if hidden. You imagine one walking home with empty arms, telling herself it was the will of the city, the will of the gods, anything but her own heartbreak. Maybe she whispered lullabies into the night, songs for a child who would never hear them, but Spartan discipline demanded silence, demanded she bury her grief as thoroughly as the hillside buried her child. Exposure also carried a strange form of social messaging. By abandoning weak children, cities signalled to everyone, citizens, neighbours, enemies, that strength was the only value that mattered. It was a public declaration of priorities, a grim way of saying, we choose survival over sentiment. Other Greeks sometimes criticised the practice, but many also respected its ruthlessness. After all, a city that could discard its weak so casually must surely field terrifying warriors. Now step closer in your mind. Picture the hillside at dawn, dew clinging to grass, the cries of exposed infants echoing faintly before fading into silence. Some are gone already, claimed by cold, others grow weaker as the sun climbs, and then perhaps a shepherd trudges past, staff tapping the ground. He pauses, hears a faint whimper, and stoops to lift a child. For that infant, destiny has shifted. For the others, the hillside remains their only cradle. It's grim, it's haunting, and yet it was woven seamlessly into Greek life. Exposure wasn't hidden, it was acknowledged, even expected. Citizens spoke of it with matter-of-fact tone, the way we might discuss taxes or chores. That normalization is perhaps the strangest part. Cruelty accepted not as cruelty, but as order. As you turn away from that hillside in your imagination, the image lingers. You realize that Greece's brilliance, its philosophy, its democracy, its art, was shadowed by customs like this. For every marble statue we admire, there were small lives left on stone. And the Greeks, practical as they were, rarely saw contradiction in that. To them, it was all part of building a society strong enough to endure. So tonight, let the strange hush of that hillside stay with you. Hear the wind moving through grass where tiny cries once faded. It is unsettling, yes, but also profoundly human. A reminder that history's brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. The morning haze lifts from the plain of Boeotia, and the air smells of dew-soaked grass, horse sweat, and iron. Ahead of you, lines of men in gleaming armour shuffle into formation, their shields locking like scales of a massive beast. It looks like any other Greek phalanx, tight, bristling, disciplined. But as you draw closer, you notice something unusual. The soldiers don't just glance at their neighbours for coordination, they look at them with fierce devotion, a tenderness hidden under bronze helmets. These are not just comrades. They are lovers. You have stepped into the ranks of the sacred band of Thebes, one of the strangest and most fascinating military experiments in the ancient world. The sacred band was no ordinary unit. Composed of about 300 men, it paired soldiers into couples, each pair bonded by affection, desire, and shared loyalty. The logic was simple yet startling. A man might flee a battlefield when fighting beside a stranger, but would he ever abandon his beloved? The Thebans believed that love was stronger than fear, that devotion to a partner could stiffen the backbone more than any commander's shout. In their view, The ultimate bond between two warriors wasn't just friendship, it was intimacy. You march with them now in your imagination. The air quivers with the clang of weapons, the stomp of marching feet, the low murmur of encouragement passed between pairs. One soldier adjusts the strap on his lover's cuirass, another grins as he hefts a shield slightly higher. It's a strange blend of romance and readiness, half wedding vow, half war cry. If you thought Valentine's Day was stressful, imagine proving your love with a spear charge. Greek society at large wasn't scandalised by this arrangement, at least not in Thebes. Relationships between men, especially older and younger, were woven into the fabric of Greek culture. But the sacred band institutionalised it in a way that was both daring and practical. Instead of whispering about romance in private, they marched it openly into battle. It was less don't ask, don't tell, and more bring your date, and by the way, he's your battle buddy. The idea wasn't just theoretical, it worked. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the sacred band stood at the very front of the Theban army, facing the Spartans, the supposed masters of Greek warfare. With spears bristling and shields pressed close, the sacred band advanced. Side by side, pairs fought with ferocity, unwilling to falter under the eyes of their beloved. The Spartans, who had for centuries terrified the rest of Greece, broke before them. That day, the sacred band shattered not just Spartan lines, but the myth of their invincibility. Love, apparently, was the ultimate military strategy. There's something almost poetic in imagining it. Couples who whispered to each other by candlelight one night found themselves the next morning pressing shoulders together under enemy arrows. A stolen kiss might be followed by a shield wall. Where modern couples argue about chores, these men settle disagreements with synchronized spear thrusts. Nothing says commitment like agreeing to stab in the same direction. Plutarch, the Greek historian, praised this arrangement, noting that men bound by love would rather die than show cowardice in front of their partner. It's the ancient equivalent of saying, "I'd take a bullet for you," except in Thebes. It wasn't just a romantic metaphor, it was literally the job description. Other Greeks had mixed feelings. Some admired the courage, others muttered about impropriety. The Spartans, oddly enough, were uncomfortable with the openness of it, despite having their own complex system of male bonds. Perhaps they didn't like being beaten by what they saw as romantic soldiers, or perhaps they feared that devotion based on affection might prove stronger than devotion based on discipline. Whatever their grumbles, the results spoke for themselves. The sacred band thrived for decades, their reputation spreading across Greece, but like many bright flames, their story ended in tragedy. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, they faced the Macedonians under a young Alexander, not yet the Great, but already formidable. The Thebans stood firm, refusing to flee even when the battle turned hopeless. When it was over, the sacred band lay slaughtered to a man, their bodies found still in formation, each lover beside his partner. It was a brutal end, but also a testimony to their creed. They hadn't broken ranks, they hadn't abandoned each other. In death, they proved their bond unshakable. Later, when the battlefield was surveyed, their corpses were noted with awe, and even enemies respected the sight. Imagine the silence that fell over that field, the hush of wind, the creak of armour cooling, the stillness of 300 men lying as if asleep in pairs. A monument was later built at the site, marking their devotion for centuries to come. You might feel a shiver at the thought, not just at the tragedy, but at the audacity. Who else in history ever said, "Let's make love the cornerstone of an army"? Where most military systems suppress romance to enforce discipline, Thebes embraced it, weaponized it, and proved that affection could be just as powerful as strategy. And there's a strange softness in it too. In a world often brutal and practical, the sacred band reminds you that even on battlefields, love can insist on a place. Shields gleam, spears stab, but at the core is something profoundly human. The refusal to leave the one you care for. That insistence turned into victories, into legend, into one of the strangest and most touching tales of Greek warfare. Now picture yourself again in their ranks. The morning sun rises, spears flashing like a field of wheat stalks in the light. Your lover's hand brushes yours briefly as you grip your shield tighter. The trumpet sounds and you charge forward, not for abstract notions of state or glory, but for the person at your side. It's terrifying, yes, but it also makes sense in a way that goes deeper than tactics. After all, what greater motivation could there be than fighting to keep your beloved alive? That was the essence of the sacred band. Not just soldiers, but lovers turned into a wall of steel and devotion. A strange thing indeed, but perhaps one of the most strangely beautiful things the Greeks ever did. The smell of roasted lamb fat drifts through the streets of Athens, mingling with the sweetness of honey cakes and the sharper tang of wine. You follow the sound of footsteps and laughter to a doorway, where a weary traveller leans against the frame, dusty from the road, cloak ragged from days of walking. Inside, a household is bustling, a servant rushing to fetch bread, another drawing water for washing, the host himself lighting a lamp. You quickly realise this isn't hospitality out of mere kindness. It is Xenia, the sacred law of guest friendship, one of the strangest and most binding customs in ancient Greece. To the Greeks, Xenia wasn't optional. It was a divine command overseen by Zeus himself, under the title Zeus Xenios, protector of strangers. The idea was simple but profound. Every guest who arrived at your doorstep might be a god in disguise. To turn them away without food or shelter wasn't just rude, it was blasphemous. Imagine living with the constant fear that the scruffy guy asking for soup might actually be Zeus testing your manners. Suddenly, your couch-surfing friend seems a little more important. The ritual followed a set order. First, you welcomed the stranger in without even asking their name. You gave them food, drink, and a bath if needed. Only after their hunger was satisfied and their feet washed did you politely inquire, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" This wasn't just etiquette. It was sacred choreography. To ask too soon would be to disrespect the god's potential disguise. Picture opening your door to a total stranger, serving them a 3-course meal, letting them nap on your couch, and only then asking, "Yao, so what's your deal?" Once the initial hospitality was extended, host and guest often exchanged gifts. These weren't cheap trinkets, they were lasting. Tokens meant to seal a bond that could endure generations. A guest gift, xenion, could be a fine cup, a cloak, or even livestock. Families kept records of these bonds, so that centuries later, descendants could claim hospitality with each other. It was less Airbnb and more eternal loyalty program. If your great-great-grandfather once hosted a traveller from Corinth, you might still expect his descendants to put you up in their house 200 years later. Talk about a long-term obligation. Greek mythology is littered with stories warning what happens when Xenia is violated. Take the tale of Paris, Prince of Troy. He was a guest in Menelaus's house, offered food, shelter, and safety. But instead of honouring Xenia, Paris violated it spectacularly by running off with Helen, Menelaus's wife. The result? 10 years of bloodshed, the fall of Troy, and centuries of poets complaining about it. The message was clear. Betray Xenia, and you doom your city. Imagine explaining to your neighbours that their houses are on fire because you stole the host's wife after being offered soup. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Another famous example is the story of Baucis and Philemon, an elderly couple who welcomed Zeus and Hermes disguised as poor travellers. While everyone else in the village turned the gods away, this couple offered their humble meal of wine and olives. In return, the gods destroyed the inhospitable villagers and turned the couple's hut into a grand temple. Hospitality literally became divine real estate investment. The lesson was drilled into Greek minds. Treat guests as sacred, because you never know who's really knocking. But Xenia wasn't just myth, it structured everyday life. Consider the practicalities. Greece was a land of scattered city-states, with no centralised hotels or inns as we know them. Travel meant relying on strangers, and Xenia ensured that travellers had food and shelter without fear. It was a survival system wrapped in piety, turning potential hostility into trust. Of course, not every host was thrilled. Imagine being an Athenian farmer, already stretched thin, when yet another traveller appeared at your door expecting bread, wine, and a spare bed. You couldn't refuse, unless you fancied divine lightning bolts ruining your harvest. Hospitality became less about generosity and more about mandatory god insurance. "Yes, stranger, please, take my last loaf of bread." "No, I'm not crying, it's just the smoke from the lamp." Still, for all its burdens, Xenia could forge extraordinary connections. Greek heroes often benefited from these bonds. Odysseus, in his endless wanderings, repeatedly relied on the kindness of hosts, and those who failed to honour Xenia were punished. In Homer's Odyssey, the suitors who overstayed their welcome in Odysseus's house, eating his food and courting his wife, became the ultimate violators of Xenia. Their punishment was swift and bloody. Odysseus returned and slaughtered them all. Lesson learned: don't freeload on someone else's hospitality, or you might end up with an arrow in your throat. The seriousness of Xenia meant that even political negotiations could revolve around it. Ambassadors arriving in foreign cities were often treated first as honoured guests, regardless of political tensions. War might be brewing, but first you had to serve bread and wine, because Zeus was watching. It was diplomacy with dinner rolls, a strange blend of courtesy and paranoia. The weirdest part? Hospitality could outlast politics. You might find yourself on the battlefield facing an enemy whose grandfather once hosted yours. In such cases, the bond of Xenia could override the duty of war. Killing your guest friend, Xenos, was seen as a horrifying act, worse than ordinary bloodshed. It's as if the gods themselves mark that person as untouchable. Loyalty to the bond sometimes surpassed loyalty to the city. The Greeks lived in a world where your life might depend not on treaties or alliances, but on whether your ancestor once shared cheese with someone else's ancestor. And yet, for all its sacred rules, Xenia wasn't immune to abuse. Some guests took advantage, lingering too long, demanding too much, or exploiting their host's generosity. Others manipulated the bond for political gain. Hosts too could twist Xenia into an obligation, trapping their guests in webs of favour and debt. Like all systems, it could be gamed. The suitors in the Odyssey weren't just freeloaders. They were parasites feeding off hospitality until the house itself nearly collapsed. Still, when practiced sincerely, Xenia offered a rare softness in a harsh world. Imagine arriving in a strange city, exhausted, vulnerable, perhaps carrying only the clothes on your back. The door opens, you're seated by the fire, food is placed in your hands before a single question is asked. That feeling of safety, of being welcomed without suspicion, was precious. In a world of war and scarcity, it must have felt almost miraculous. Picture yourself as that traveller. You've walked for days under the Greek sun, your feet blistered, your throat parched. You knock hesitantly on a stranger's door, expecting perhaps a curt refusal. Instead, you're ushered inside, given bread soaked in olive oil, wine to ease your thirst, a basin of water to wash the dust away. You sigh with relief, sinking into cushions. Only after your hunger is eased does the host ask your name. For that moment you feel like kin, even if you met minutes ago. That was the essence of Xenia. Strangers turned to family by ritual, fear turned to trust by divine law. It's strange, isn't it? A culture that abandoned infants on hillsides also treated wandering strangers with sacred reverence. The contradictions of Greece never stop surprising you. To them, cruelty and kindness weren't opposites, but tools applied in different contexts. Babies might be expendable, but guests were untouchable. It was less about compassion than about maintaining cosmic order, ensuring the gods saw balance in all things. So tonight, as you picture that Athenian hearth glowing warmly, bread being broken between host and guest, let the oddness settle in. A society both ruthless and gracious, both brutal and tender, could hold those contradictions without blinking. And perhaps, in that flicker of the oil lamp, you glimpse why the Greeks remain so endlessly fascinating. The Athenian sun beats down on marble steps, and you hear the chatter of young men gathering in the gymnasium, the scent of olive oil mingling with dust and sweat. Here, beneath shaded porticos, knowledge and desire blur in a way that makes you shift uncomfortably in your sandals. This is the world of pederasty, one of ancient Greece's most peculiar and controversial customs, a practice that the Greeks themselves justified as mentorship, but which modern eyes can't help but find unsettling. In its idealized form, pederasty paired an adult male citizen, the Erastes, lover, with an adolescent boy, the Eromenos, beloved. The older man was expected to guide the younger into adulthood, teaching him rhetoric, athletics, military skills, and civic virtues. In exchange, the boy offered admiration, loyalty, and companionship. At least that's the polished version carved into Greek philosophy and vase paintings. In reality, the boundaries were murkier. Was it education? Was it romance? Or was it exploitation cloaked in cultural ritual? The answer was all of the above, depending on where you stood. Picture yourself at a symposium, reclining on cushions as wine is poured. Around you, philosophers debate ethics while flute players trill soft melodies. At the edge of the room, you notice a young boy seated beside an older man, receiving not just conversation, but the kind of attention that modern etiquette would frown upon. No one in the room looks scandalized. For them, this pairing is expected, even celebrated, a rite of passage rather than a taboo. You sip your wine, cheeks warming, wondering if you've stumbled into a school, a courtship, or something that feels like both at once. In Sparta, the practice leaned heavily toward the educational. Boys entered the agoge, the state-run training system, where older men often became mentors, sometimes with romantic undertones, sometimes strictly pedagogical. The focus was military, shaping the boy into a warrior by pairing him with an experienced soldier. In Athens, however, the arrangement was often more openly erotic, though still wrapped in rules. A proper Erastes was expected to court the boy with gifts, poems, and public devotion, proving his worthiness. The boy's consent mattered, at least nominally. Ideally, he wasn't supposed to yield easily. Resistance showed virtue, but eventually he might accept the bond if the Erastes proved sincere. The line between affection and coercion, however, was thin. Philosophers themselves couldn't agree. Plato, in his Symposium, praised love between men as the highest form of devotion, a spiritual bond that elevated the soul. In another dialogue, he condemned physical consummation as base, urging restraint. Socrates, meanwhile, played the part of the sly commentator, suggesting that true love was about shared pursuit of wisdom, not flesh. You can almost hear them debating endlessly, sipping watered wine and trying to rationalize a custom that sat uncomfortably even in their own day. The visual record makes things stranger still. Greek vase paintings often depict these relationships with awkward frankness, a bearded man offering a hare or rooster to a younger boy, tokens of courtship not unlike jewellery or flowers today. It's history's oddest dating ritual. I love you. Here's a chicken. Somewhere a poet probably wrote an ode comparing adolescent beauty to freshly plucked feathers. If you don't laugh, you'll wince. The oddity wasn't just in the relationships themselves, but in the rules surrounding them. For example, the Eromenos was not supposed to be passive in every sense. He could accept mentorship and affection, but if he appeared too eager or submissive, society mocked him. A boy who enjoyed the attention too openly risked shame, branded as effeminate. Only when he matured into adulthood could he switch roles and pursue younger partners himself. It was a revolving door of mentorship, an endless cycle of older teaching younger, each generation repeating the pattern. Athens codified some of this in law. There were restrictions about age, consent, and circumstances. An older man caught exploiting a freeborn boy outside the acceptable framework could face public disgrace or fines. Yet the line was blurry because what counted as acceptable framework depended on context. Slaves, for example, were excluded from such protections. Their bodies were always fair game. Once again, democracy drew sharp boundaries between who counted as fully human and who didn't. From the modern perspective, it's deeply uncomfortable. You feel your shoulders tighten as you imagine those boys, caught between admiration, pressure, and societal expectation. And yet, for the Greeks it wasn't framed as abuse but as education. They believed older men instilled virtues, courage, wisdom, discipline, that no classroom could provide. It was an apprenticeship of body and soul. To them the danger wasn't that boys would be exploited, but that they might fail to learn masculinity properly if they avoided these bonds. This practice reveals the strange paradox at the heart of Greek culture. A society that birthed democracy, philosophy and art also normalized power dynamics that today strike us as exploitative. They spoke loftily of love elevating the soul, while turning adolescence into a kind of currency. They painted tender scenes of guidance beside images that feel, frankly, like predation. It's a contradiction that refuses to sit comfortably no matter how much context you add. Still, within the Greek world, pederasty could carry genuine affection. Some pairs formed lifelong bonds, their devotion celebrated in poetry and remembered in epitaphs. The sacred band of Thebes, which you glimpsed earlier, grew out of this very tradition. Lovers turned into soldiers whose passion forged unbreakable courage. So while the practice may disturb you, it also produced instances of loyalty and love that transcended cynicism. History rarely gives us clean categories, it gives us contradictions. Imagine being a boy in Athens, 15 years old, walking through the agora with an older admirer trailing behind, offering compliments, perhaps reciting Homeric verses in your honour. Do you blush with pride? Do you squirm with discomfort? Do you secretly hope he brings a better gift than yesterday's rooster? Whatever your reaction, society expects you to navigate it gracefully. To reject too harshly is rude. To yield too quickly is shameful. Your adolescence becomes theatre, played for the audience of your peers. Meanwhile, the philosophers continue their endless arguments. One praises the bond as divine, another warns of corruption, a third shrugs and orders more wine. The whole city seems complicit in this strange balancing act, pretending it's mentorship while winking at its obvious intimacy. You sip your imaginary wine alongside them, equal parts amused and unsettled, wondering how they manage to live with the contradiction so comfortably. As night falls in your mind's eye, the symposium fades, leaving only the flicker of oil lamps and the faint sound of a flute. You think of those boys, those men, those bonds praised as noble, yet practiced with awkward gifts and stricter power lines. It's a custom as weird as it is revealing, showing you how the Greeks could elevate desire into philosophy while grounding it in rituals that today would raise every possible alarm. Strange, isn't it? A civilization that prized reason so highly could justify such irrational arrangements. And yet, for them, it made sense. Love, mentorship and desire bound together in a knot too tight to untangle. As you drift from the symposium into the quiet Athenian streets, the echo of their laughter and debate follows you, a reminder that brilliance and strangeness often walk hand in hand. The agora is loud this morning. Sandals scraping marble, merchants shouting over fish and figs, children darting between stalls. But then a hush passes like a breeze through the crowd. Men gather, their chitons brushing together as they clutch small shards of pottery. The shards clink softly as they're shuffled in hands and baskets. You lean closer and realise this isn't a marketplace, it's a vote. Not for leaders, not for laws, but for exile. This is ostracism, one of Athens' strangest democratic customs. The practice of politely kicking someone out of the city for 10 years with no trial, no crime, and no appeal. The scene plays out with almost theatrical calm. Citizens file past a designated area, scratching names onto broken pieces of pottery called ostraca. The shards were cheap, plentiful and disposable, a kind of ancient sticky note, except your scribble could end someone's career. One man writes Themistocles, another scratches Timon, while others scrawl names of rivals, unpopular loudmouths, or simply men who looked a little too ambitious. By the end of the day, the collection of ostraca piles up, a jagged mountain of broken clay carrying enough weight to uproot a citizen's life. Ostracism began as a safeguard. Athens, fiercely proud of its democracy, lived in perpetual fear of tyrants. Memories of despots like Pisistratos and his sons haunted the city. So the Athenians invented this peculiar mechanism. Once a year they would ask the people, "Shall we hold an ostracism?" If the answer was yes, names would be cast, and whoever received the most votes would be banished. No execution, no confiscation of property, just 10 years of enforced vacation, whether you liked it or not. Imagine it. You're a rising politician, basking in your recent victories. Suddenly you wake one morning to find your name scratched onto hundreds of shards. By evening you're packing your bags. You still own your home, your land, your fortune. You just can't set foot in Athens for a decade. If you sneak back early, the penalty is death. But if you wait it out, you can return. Reputation bruised but not broken. It's exile with an expiration date. Democracy's version of cooling off time. The rules had a strange fairness to them. The ostracised man wasn't disgraced permanently, he was merely too much. Too popular, too ambitious, too dangerous. Ostracism functioned like a civic pressure valve, releasing tension before political rivalries boiled over. Instead of assassinations or coups, Athens used pottery shards. It's oddly civilized. Imagine if modern politics could be diffused by sending a would-be dictator to Mykonos with a strict 10-year return policy. And yet, the system was far from perfect. For one thing, it could be manipulated. Political factions often campaigned behind the scenes, pushing citizens to vote out rivals. Ordinary Athenians might scratch a name without much thought, swept along by gossip or momentary irritation. It wasn't about guilt, it was about popularity or lack thereof. You could be exiled not for treason, but for being annoying at symposia. If Twitter polls had legal power, ostracism would be their closest cousin. Take Themistocles, for example. Hero of the Persian Wars, mastermind of Athens' naval victories, the man practically saved the city. Yet a few years later, his ambition and arrogance grated on his peers. Suddenly, his name filled the ostraca, and off he went into exile. He didn't return triumphantly. Instead, he fled further east, eventually dying in Persia. Imagine if Winston Churchill, fresh from World War II, was voted off the island survivor style and forced to live in Moscow. That's the level of absurdity Athens embraced. Sometimes ostracism backfired spectacularly. There's the story of Aristides, known as the Just, a man so respected for fairness that his very reputation became annoying. During one vote, an illiterate citizen handed him a shard and asked him to write a name on it. "Whose name shall I write?" Aristides asked. The man replied, "Aristides. I'm tired of hearing him called the Just everywhere." Aristides, without protest, wrote his own name, and off he went. Democracy at its finest, exiling a man for the crime of being too virtuous. The process itself had a curious ritualistic air. The ostraka bore crude scratchings, names hastily etched, sometimes with insults added: Simon Philolaconian, Simon, lover of Sparta, or Themistocles, thief. You picture thousands of fragments piling up, each shard an ancient tweet carved in clay. The clerks counted them carefully, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. When the final tally came, the condemned man didn't face shackles or chains. Instead, he was escorted politely to the city gates, free to take his belongings, free to keep his honour, but firmly told, "Don't come back for 10 years." It must have been a surreal punishment. Some men used exile productively, travelling, studying, or managing estates elsewhere. Others stewed in bitterness, waiting for the day they could re-enter the city that had turned its back on them. A decade is long enough for children to grow up, for alliances to shift, for memory to fade. Returning after ostracism meant stepping into a world where your friends might have moved on, your rivals might be dead, and your name was a ghost of politics past. The oddest part? Ostracism wasn't permanent in Athenian law. After the 10 years, the man could return and society was expected to reintegrate him without stigma. No grudges, no black marks. It was as if the city collectively said, "We didn't hate you, we just needed a break." Imagine explaining that to your children. Dad didn't do anything wrong, the city just got tired of him for a decade. Therapy bills would write themselves. In practice, ostracism fell out of use. By the later 5th century, it was replaced by harsher tools like prosecution and execution. But for a time, it was a strangely elegant solution, democracy's way of diffusing conflict without bloodshed. A society so inventive that it could exile someone with kindness, banish with courtesy, and punish ambition by granting a 10-year sabbatical. You can almost picture the morning after a vote. The agora hums again, merchants back to their shouting, children back to their games. The exile's house stands empty, dust gathering on the threshold. Life flows on, the city lighter by one man's presence. Citizens shrug and move on. Ostracism wasn't drama, it was routine. That, perhaps, is the strangest part. How calmly Athenians treated this bizarre civic ritual. So tonight, as you imagine those shards clinking together, picture yourself dropping a name into the pile. Whose ambition do you fear? Whose popularity grates on your ears? You scratch the letters awkwardly, hand over the shard and walk away. Later you hear the verdict. The man is gone. No blood spilled, no trial argued, just a suitcase packed and a gate closed. It's weird, it's unsettling, and yet, in its own way, it was brilliant. The Greeks found a way to exile without hatred, to punish without cruelty, to maintain democracy with shards of broken pottery. Strange tools for a strange people, and a reminder that sometimes the weirdest ideas are the ones that keep societies from tearing themselves apart. The streets of Athens cool in the evening, a breeze sweeping through narrow alleys, carrying the scents of grilled fish, garlic, and cheap wine. In the shadowy corners of these homes and symposium halls lies another strange, unsettling practice. The laws of adultery, where morality, honour, and absurd double standards collided in ways that could make your jaw drop. Imagine yourself seated in a dim Athenian courtyard. Oil lamps flicker, casting shadows against painted walls. From behind a thin partition, voices rise. A husband has caught his wife in bed with another man. Today, you'd expect shouts, maybe a divorce lawyer, maybe a very awkward couples therapy session. But in Athens, the husband had a legal right that feels ripped from a gladiator script. He could kill the male adulterer on the spot, no questions asked, and walk away guiltless. Not even a trial. Just swing the sword, wipe the blade, and head back to the agora for figs. The rationale? It wasn't about love or fidelity in the romantic sense. It was about honour. An adulterer wasn't just sleeping with a wife. He was trespassing on another man's household, insulting his masculinity, threatening the legitimacy of his children. Adultery was treated less like private betrayal and more like vandalising someone's civic property. And in a society where women were cloistered in the gyneceum, the women's quarters, the insult struck doubly hard. Of course, this law came with odd wrinkles. The husband could kill the adulterer only if caught in the act. If he hesitated, or if the affair was merely rumoured, the opportunity evaporated. It turned catching adultery into a grotesque game of timing. Imagine bursting into the bedroom, sword drawn, only to discover the man already putting on his sandals. Too late. Now you had to take him to court instead, where fines and humiliation awaited, but not execution. Ancient law was nothing if not punctual. And the wife? Her punishment wasn't death, but it was still brutal in social terms. A woman caught in adultery could be divorced instantly, stripped of her dowry, barred from attending religious rites, and in some cases forced into prostitution. It wasn't just about disgrace, it was about public utility. The unfaithful wife became a body for sale, her former role as citizen wife erased entirely. The state turned her shame into a warning for others. You picture the whispers in the agora. That one? She used to be respectable, now she's just a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the husband was free to pursue extramarital affairs of his own. Men could visit heterae, educated courtesans who mingled at symposia, or even frequent brothels without legal risk. Fidelity was demanded of wives, not of husbands. The double standard was stark, glaring, and accepted with a straight face. If hypocrisy were an Olympic sport, Athens would have taken gold. The heterae complicate this picture. Unlike wives who lived in seclusion, heterae moved freely in society, conversing with politicians and philosophers, even shaping public discourse. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was notorious not just for her wit but for influencing policy. And yet, these women were simultaneously respected for their intellect and dismissed as scandalous. They occupied a strange social niche, admired in public, scorned in private, forever outside the walls of respectable marriage. It's as if the Greeks wanted both entertainment and condemnation neatly packaged in the same person. Consider the bizarre spectacle this created. A husband could entertain a hetera at dinner, laugh at her jokes, perhaps slip into her bed afterward, and then walk home self-righteous enough to stab his wife's lover should he find one. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. To the Greeks, it was simply order. The wife guarded the household, the hetera entertained, the husband enjoyed both privileges. Balance, of a very lopsided kind. Even stranger were the legal defences tied to adultery cases. An adulterer caught and spared might still be dragged before a jury, where arguments flew like arrows. Orators thundered about corrupting the household or threatening the bloodline. One speech by Lysias, a famous orator, describes in chilling calm how a husband caught his wife's lover, lured him out, killed him, and then defended himself in court by simply citing the law. I was within my rights. The jury nodded. Case closed. Imagine court transcripts today reading, "Yes, I killed him, but the law said it was fine." Adultery laws also exposed the deeper anxieties of Greek society. Behind the bluster about honour was the fear of illegitimate children, offspring who might inherit property without truly belonging to the family's bloodline. Inheritance was sacred. Land passed through sons, not daughters, and a single illegitimate child threatened to disrupt the entire system. To guard against this, women's movements were tightly controlled, their social lives restricted. Athenian wives rarely appeared in public, and when they did, they were veiled and accompanied. The household became both prison and shrine, protecting lineage at the cost of liberty. And yet, despite all these restrictions, affairs still happened. Human desire has never paid much attention to legal codes. The danger may even have made it more enticing. Forbidden meetings, whispered exchanges in doorways, notes passed through servants. The very risks created romance. Picture a woman leaning out her window at night, glancing nervously at the courtyard where her husband's guard dog dozes. Across the street her lover waits in shadows. Every creak of the wooden floor could mean discovery and ruin, yet still she moves forward. Love, or lust, makes gamblers of us all. The contradictions pile up. Athens prided itself on rational debate, on philosophy that dissected truth and justice. Yet in bedrooms and courts, reason gave way to jealousy, fear, and control. A husband might recite Plato at dinner, then stalk his house for intruders with a dagger at midnight. A wife might pray to Hera for marital harmony while secretly passing tokens to another man. Laws loomed like spectres, reminding everyone that passion could be fatal. It's worth pausing to imagine what this felt like for women. A young bride, perhaps 14, married off to a man twice her age, confined to her quarters, instructed to weave wool and raise children. She knows her husband visits Hetaere, but she dares not speak. If loneliness drives her into another's arms, she risks everything. Dignity, home, even freedom. Her body belongs less to herself than to the state's obsession with bloodlines. If she falters, she isn't simply punished, she's erased from respectable life. The unfairness burns, even across centuries, and yet the Hetaerae offer a counterpoint. These women, though scorned as outsiders, sometimes wielded real influence. They could speak freely in symposia, mocking men's politics, engaging in witty debate. They lived on the margins, but carved out power in those margins. Aspasia herself hosted gatherings of philosophers, her intelligence admired even by Socrates. While wives were silenced, Hetaere spoke, proof that gender roles were less about ability than about control. The contradiction is as loud as the streets of Athens themselves. What makes this entire custom weird, in the truer sense, is how normalised it was. Adultery wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was legislated, debated, ritualised. Husbands didn't just fear it, they trained for it, learned the laws and rehearsed their rights. The very act of bursting into a room with sword drawn became almost theatrical, a civic performance of honour. You wonder how many affairs were ended not by passion fading, but by the fear of steel flashing in the lamplight. As you leave the imagined Athenian courtyard, the oil lamps dimming behind you, the absurdity lingers. A society that celebrated love in poetry, that carved eros into statues and sang of desire in theatres, simultaneously reduced marriage to property management and punished women mercilessly for seeking the same freedoms men indulged in daily. It's messy, it's hypocritical, and it's entirely human. So tonight, when you think of Greece, don't picture only marble temples and lofty debates. Picture too the quiet slam of a bedroom door, the scrape of pottery in a jury's hand, the whispered warning of a neighbour who saw too much. Strange laws for a strange society. Laws that reveal just how deeply fear and control can masquerade as honour. The Athenian air is warm, the cicadas humming so loudly you can almost hear their wings vibrate. Marble columns gleam under the sunlight, casting long shadows across an open grove dotted with olive trees. A group of young men walks together, tunics light, sandals scraping against gravel. At their centre strides a bearded figure gesturing with his hands, his words flowing like a river, questions, answers, challenges. This is philosophy, not locked away in dusty lecture halls, but alive under the sky. Tonight you step into the world of Greek learning, where knowledge wasn't confined to buildings but strolled in gardens, walked through colonnades, and spilled into the city streets. Picture yourself following Plato through the academy, just outside the city walls. It isn't a university in the modern sense. There are no classrooms with chalkboards, no neat rows of benches. Instead, there's a gymnasium, a grove sacred to the hero Academus, and groups of students wandering between statues of gods and shaded paths. Lessons here look more like arguments stretched across walks. Plato pauses beneath a tree, asks a question so sharp it makes one student frown, and another laugh nervously. He pushes them not toward facts, but toward reflection, stripping assumptions bare until only the bones of truth remain. It's a strange kind of schooling. No textbooks, no exams, no grades, only the endless volley of thought. You're not memorizing dates or formulas, you're wrestling with ideas. Plato might demand, "What is justice?" and you'd better have more than a shrug for an answer. The academy was less about giving knowledge than about unmaking ignorance, a kind of intellectual boot camp with words as weapons. In your mind you see students rubbing their temples, muttering that the philosopher never gives answers, only more questions. It's enough to make you long for multiple choice quizzes. And yet this wandering style of education had its power. Ideas didn't sit on parchment, they danced in the air. A question raised under olive branches could change how a student saw the world forever. The academy became the seedbed of philosophy, sprouting theories of reality, ethics, and governance that would echo for millennia. It's odd, isn't it? The most lasting ideas of Western thought were born not in lecture halls but in outdoor strolls, more picnic than seminar. Now shift your steps to Aristotle's Lyceum and the rhythm changes. Aristotle preferred walking as he taught, his students pacing alongside him, scribbling notes, trying desperately to keep up with his torrent of observations. The Lyceum was both school and research hub, with collections of specimens, maps, and records. If Plato chased ideals, Aristotle chased details. He catalogued plants, animals, constitutions, anything that could be observed and classified. Imagine him pausing mid-walk to pluck a leaf, holding it up to the sun, and launching into a lecture about veins and structures, while his students groaned about blisters forming on their feet. No wonder his followers were nicknamed the Peripatetics, the walkers. Learning here was cardio with philosophy as the prize. Education wasn't limited to these famous schools. In Athens, philosophy spilled everywhere. Socrates, that gadfly of the city, preferred public spaces, workshops, markets, even street corners. You might be buying olives when suddenly he appeared, peering at you with those unsettling eyes, asking, "Do you truly know what courage is?" Before you know it, you've dropped your coins and are caught in a debate you never wanted. A trip to the market could turn into a pop quiz from the most persistent teacher in history. This openness made Greek education unique. Knowledge wasn't hidden, it was performed, debated, shared aloud. Anyone passing by could overhear a discussion and even join in if bold enough. The city itself became a classroom, its stones echoing with questions about truth, virtue, and the soul. It was chaotic, messy, and strangely democratic, though of course limited to free men. Women, slaves, and foreigners might hear the words but rarely had a voice. The chorus of debate rang loudly, but it didn't include everyone. Still, there was something liberating in the informality. Imagine standing in a grove as a breeze stirs the olive branches, your teacher pacing, students interrupting, ideas colliding like flint against steel. No parchment could capture the heat of those moments, the thrill of minds sparking in real time. It wasn't about rote learning, but transformation, leaving a discussion changed, unsettled, hungry for more. You might walk away muttering, "I don't know what justice is anymore," but somehow that felt like progress. At the same time, education was physical. The gymnasia weren't just for thought, but for exercise. Young men oiled their bodies, wrestled, raced, trained for war, and then sat down, sweaty and gleaming, to discuss poetry and politics. Mind and body, the Greeks believed, had to be trained together. Imagine a student arriving home, muscles sore from wrestling, brains sore from Plato's questions. No wonder they invented reclining couches. Lying down was the only way to recover from so much philosophy. It's easy to romanticize all this, wandering beneath olive trees, debating under the stars. But the reality could be exhausting. Not every student adored endless questions. Some rolled their eyes, others mocked the philosophers in plays. Aristophanes lampooned Socrates in the clouds, painting him as a ridiculous babbler suspended in a basket to study the heavens. Athenians laughed, recognizing their city's tendency to overthink everything. After all, who else would create a custom where a walk to the gym turned into a 3-hour dissection of metaphysics? And yet, for all the strangeness, the method worked. The academy and lyceum trained minds that reshaped civilization. Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Socratic dialogue. These weren't dry treatises, but living echoes of conversations held in groves and colonnades. The Greeks didn't just theorize, they performed thought like theatre. It was entertainment, education, and sometimes endurance test rolled into one. Imagine yourself walking there now, sandals scuffing the gravel, sweat beading on your brow. Plato turns to you suddenly asks, What is the good life? You stammer, laugh nervously, mutter something about figs and naps. He frowns, presses you further. Soon you're tangled in questions about virtue, pleasure, duty. The cicadas shriek overhead, the olive branches sway, and you realise your afternoon is gone, swallowed by philosophy. You're tired, a little dizzy, but somehow you feel alive. That was the gift of Greek education. Not answers, but endless questions. Strange, frustrating, yet unforgettable. A society that could exile politicians by pottery shards, that abandoned infants on hillsides, also gave us this, the relentless pursuit of thought under open skies. Weird? Yes. But perhaps that weirdness is why it endures. The evening sky over Greece dims to purple, torches flickering against stone walls, and the murmur of voices lowers to a hush. Tonight you've wandered not into a symposium or a grove of philosophers, but into the darker corners of Greek life. Places where justice wasn't always about debate or persuasion, but about punishment. You see a small crowd gathered outside the city gates, sandals crunching over gravel, their expressions solemn, expectant, a little eager. Someone has been condemned. In Greece, punishments carried a peculiar mixture of ritual, cruelty, and, strangest of all, practicality. One of the most common was stoning. Imagine a man dragged into the centre of the crowd, arms bound, head bare. Citizens bend down, hefting stones already lying ready on the ground. No executioner swings an axe here. The city itself delivers the sentence. The condemned man's neighbours, fellow market-goers, perhaps even distant relatives, raise stones and throw them until he crumples. The punishment was brutal, but communal. Everyone shared the guilt. Everyone shared the cleansing. It was as if the city itself picked up the first stone. The crowd disperses afterward, murmuring about dinner, leaving the square dotted with broken rock and blood. A reminder that in Greece, even killing could be democracy in action. Another method was more theatrical, being cast from a cliff or pit. In Sparta, criminals, traitors, or even unwanted infants might be hurled from the Taygetus mountains. Picture the sheer drop, wind howling, the earth rushing up. It was quick, impersonal, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. The cliff did the work, the state simply delivered the push. Other cities used pits, dark hollows where the condemned were thrown to die of broken bones or thirst. There's a strange finality in it. No blade, no fire, just gravity and silence. The land itself became executioner. Perhaps the most famous punishment, though, was poisoning, specifically the cup of hemlock. You already know the story. Socrates, accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, sat calmly in a prison cell as his students wept. The jailer brought the cup, the philosopher took it in his hand, asked a few final questions about the immortality of the soul, then drank it without trembling. Soon his legs went numb, then his chest until he lay still. No gallows, no blade, just a plant, its juice bitter and lethal. Execution by hemlock wasn't common, but it left the most lasting impression. A thinker's death, in a way, matching Athens' obsession with mixing intellect and punishment. Imagine modern courts handing out lethal essays instead of prison terms. You're sentenced to death by poison, but please deliver a final lecture first. Greeks also borrowed from neighbours. Crucifixion, though often linked with Rome, did appear in certain Greek states, particularly as a punishment for slaves or foreign criminals. Sometimes the condemned was tied, not nailed, left to die slowly from thirst, exposure, or exhaustion. Picture the body sagging against wooden beams, the sun-blistering skin, flies buzzing. It was meant less as a swift execution than as a warning, a billboard of agony erected for all to see. If you thought advertising was modern, think again. Greeks advertised punishment with human bodies strung up on posts. There were darker tales too. Impalement, rare but mentioned in Greek sources, usually borrowed from Persian practices. A sharpened stake driven through the body, the victim hoisted upright until death came slowly. Such methods were rare, but the fact they existed at all shows how far punishment could stretch in times of fear. Greeks often criticised foreign cruelty, but when desperation struck, they proved just as inventive. What truly unnerves is the treatment of bodies after death. For Greeks, burial wasn't just a ritual, it was sacred necessity. To die without proper burial meant the soul wandered restlessly, unable to cross the river Styx. Denying someone burial was therefore the ultimate insult. worse than death itself. A criminal might be left unburied on the roadside, his corpse food for crows and dogs. Families wept not just for loss but for damnation, their loved one condemned to eternal unrest. In some cases, bodies were displayed publicly, rotting in the sun, a grotesque billboard of deterrence. Imagine walking to market each day past the same dangling corpse, reminded of your city's laws by its stench. Subtlety was not the goal. Sometimes the punishment was more symbolic than physical. A man condemned for treason might have his name erased from public records, his statues pulled down, his memory damned. This was a different kind of death, not of body but of reputation. Greeks understood that being forgotten could sting worse than the sword. Picture waking to find your name chipped from inscriptions, your children forbidden to speak of you. In a society obsessed with glory and immortality of fame, erasure was annihilation. Yet, for all the cruelty, some punishments carried a strange sense of fairness. Execution by hemlock, for example, was considered clean, no blood, no spectacle. It was reserved for citizens, a mark of respect even in death. Slaves might be crucified, foreigners stoned, but citizens could sip poison in dignity. There's something grimly comical about that distinction. Death served in classes like seating on a plane. Citizen, please step into the quiet chamber with your cup. Slave, the post is outside, in the sun. And then there was the paradox of ritual cleansing. When a murderer was executed, the community sometimes held purification ceremonies to cleanse the pollution of spilled blood. Priests sprinkled water, recited prayers, lit fires. It's as though they knew punishment itself stained the city, and so they had to wash it away. One wonders if the ritual comforted anyone, or if it only reminded them that violence clung no matter how much water was sprinkled. Of course, Greeks also enjoyed irony in their punishments. Thieves might be forced to parade naked, cheats in markets might have their wares burned before their eyes. Public humiliation was as sharp as the whip, cutting deeper than wounds. After all, in a city where reputation was everything, shame could cripple a man longer than a broken bone. As you imagine these punishments, you begin to feel the strange blend of severity and symbolism. The Greeks weren't just trying to kill or deter, they were making statements. A stoning declared community unity. A cliff fall declared divine judgment. A cup of poison declared civic authority. Punishment was theatre, performed before citizens as both warning and lesson. It was a civic ritual as much as it was justice. And yet, amid this cruelty, contradictions abound. The same society that left corpses unburied also wrote tragedies mourning dishonoured dead. The same city that calmly handed Socrates' poison also built statues honouring freedom of speech. They could justify brutality with one hand and write odes to mercy with the other. To them, justice was never clean. It was messy, layered, laced with fear and reverence. Now, close your eyes and picture it once more. The torches flaring, the crowd gathered, the condemned standing silent. Perhaps tonight it is a thief, tomorrow a philosopher. A stone is lifted, a stake is hammered, a cup is raised. Around it all the city watches, nods, disperses. Life continues. Olives still sold, plays still staged, temples still shining. But somewhere in the stones, in the soil, in the air itself, lingers the memory of punishment. A reminder that in Greece, justice was never just about law. It was about spectacle, order, and the strange conviction that cruelty, if done in ritual, could cleanse. The road to Delphi winds upward through craggy hills, cypress trees swaying in the wind, their dark leaves whispering secrets. You hear the faint tinkle of bells from goatherds far below and smell resin and thyme crushed under your sandals. As you climb, marble columns appear, gleaming in the sun, each step pulling you deeper into the heart of one of the strangest and most mysterious places of the ancient world, the Oracle of Delphi and the Sanctuaries of Healing, where Greeks turned to gods not just for answers, but for cures. Tonight you step into a world of vapours, visions and serpents slithering under sacred altars. At the centre of it all stood the Temple of Apollo, perched dramatically on the slope of Mount Parnassus. Pilgrims came from every corner of Greece, kings seeking advice before wars, farmers asking about their crops, couples desperate for children. They brought offerings, gold tripods, carved statues, bolts of fine cloth. The air smelled of incense and sweat, heavy with anticipation. You shuffle forward with them, heart pounding. Somewhere inside, the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, waits to speak the god's will. The ritual itself was unsettling. The Pythia, often a middle-aged woman, would bathe in the sacred Castalian spring, chew laurel leaves, and then descend into a chamber beneath the temple. There, she sat on a tripod over a fissure in the rock. Vapours rose, sweet, strange, perhaps intoxicating. She rocked back and forth, muttered, sometimes screamed, her voice breaking into incomprehensible syllables. To the Greeks, this was divine possession, Apollo himself speaking through her body. To you, it might look like a seizure, or like someone deeply intoxicated. Either way, her words spilled out jagged and raw. But she didn't speak alone. Attendant priests hovered, catching her babble, reshaping it into riddling verse. A king might hear, "If you cross the river, a great empire will fall." Encouraged, he marched, only to discover that the fallen empire was his own. The oracle's ambiguity wasn't a bug, it was the feature. She never lied, but she never clarified. Imagine paying a fortune for a prophecy only to realize later you'd been tricked by grammar. Yet rulers kept coming, because even riddles from the gods carried more authority than silence. For the Greeks, the oracle wasn't odd, it was central. Politics, war, colonization, all could hinge on her utterances. Entire cities were founded because the Pythia mumbled that settlers should seek the land where the wooden walls stand. People scrambled to interpret, drawing maps from metaphors. History itself bent around her words. Picture a general pacing outside the temple, chewing his lip, praying that the priestess's incoherent shouts would align with his ambitions. He listens, nods, and convinces himself it was divine approval. Then thousands march to their deaths, comforted that Apollo endorsed it. The strangeness deepens when you shift from Apollo's oracle to the sanctuaries of Asclepius, god of healing. These weren't clinics as we know them. They were temples where medicine, faith, and ritual melted into one. Pilgrims arrived sick or injured, sometimes carried on litters, groaning with fever or blindness. They bathed in sacred waters, offered sacrifices, and then entered special sleeping chambers for a ritual called incubation. Imagine lying on a stone bench in a dark hall, the air thick with incense, sacred snakes slithering freely across the floor. You drift into uneasy sleep, hoping the god himself will appear in your dreams with a cure. Some claimed they awoke miraculously healed. Others reported visions where Asclepius prescribed treatments, a new diet, exercise, a poultice of herbs. Priests conveniently stationed nearby interpreted the dreams and dispensed remedies. Sometimes they offered sensible advice. Eat more vegetables, walk daily, rest your mind. Other times the cures were bizarre. Rub clay on the wound, chant hymns, or allow snakes to lick the skin. Sacred serpents were believed to embody the god's presence. Their touch was thought to draw sickness out. Imagine waking at dawn, seeing a serpent's forked tongue brush your arm and whispering to yourself, "Yes, I feel better already." Skeptical? The Greeks weren't. Stories of miraculous healings filled stone inscriptions at Epidaurus, the most famous sanctuary. One man claimed blindness cured after a dream where the god applied a salve. Another woman thanked Asclepius for delivering her baby safely after she dreamed he stood by her bedside. In a way, these were ancient hospital reviews carved for all to read. The temples became health centres, packed with hopeful pilgrims. Priests blended herbal knowledge with divine theatre, offering a strange fusion of science and superstition. And here lies the weirdest part. Some of these cures actually worked. Modern historians suggest incubation rituals might have functioned as early psychotherapy. Patients slept in quiet, safe settings, their anxieties soothed by ritual. Dreams gave them symbolic solutions, interpreted as divine wisdom. Add in basic hygiene, bathing in springs, eating fresh diets, and the sick often improved. Faith, expectation, and a little placebo magic did what primitive medicine alone couldn't. The gods got the credit, but human psychology was doing much of the heavy lifting. Yet there was always spectacle. Pilgrims offered sacrifices of roosters, goats, or coins, their gifts funding the temple. Priests paraded statues, incense filled the air, and snakes coiled dramatically across altars. Healing wasn't just treatment, it was theatre. You can almost hear the whispers. "Did you hear?" A blind man left with new eyes, rumours spread, attracting more pilgrims, each seeking miracles. These sanctuaries were the ancient equivalent of wellness retreats, combining spa vibes with divine intervention. Of course, skeptics existed even then. Some philosophers rolled their eyes at the tales, muttering that gullible peasants mistook coincidence for cure. Others pointed out that many patients never left the sanctuaries alive. Their failures were simply ignored while successes were trumpeted. Still, belief persisted, because for the desperate, hope itself was healing. Better dream of Asclepius brushing your brow than to sit in silence awaiting death. The parallel between Delphi and Asclepius is striking. Both dealt in ambiguity, both thrived on ritual, and both gave Greeks what they craved most, a sense that the divine noticed them. Whether through riddles or dreams, gods spoke and humans listened, twisting their words into guidance, comfort, or cures. Now close your eyes and imagine yourself as a pilgrim. You've walked for days, body aching, illness gnawing at your chest. You enter the temple of Asclepius, lie down on the cold stone bench, clutching a sprig of laurel. Snakes slide softly near your feet. You drift into dream, see a figure cloaked in light who whispers, "Rest, drink water, eat figs." You awake, oddly refreshed, symptoms eased by the ritual itself. Was it medicine? Was it magic? In Greece, the line never mattered. The result was enough. And that, perhaps, is what makes these customs so wonderfully weird. A culture so logical in philosophy embraced prophecy and snake-licking cures without flinching. They debated ethics by day and dreamed of divine healing by night. It's a contradiction only Greece could sustain. Reason and mysticism, side by side, each considered essential to life. So as the sun sets behind Mount Parnassus in your mind, picture the temple glowing with torchlight, pilgrims murmuring prayers, priests whispering interpretations, and snakes gliding silently underfoot. It is strange, unsettling, yet profoundly human. The desperate search for meaning in chaos, the longing for someone, God, dream, or oracle, to say, "You will be healed, you will be guided, you are not alone." The torches of Athens flicker in the night. Air, smoke curling upward, and laughter spills out from the grand theatre of Dionysus, nestled on the slope of the Acropolis. The benches are crowded with citizens, cloaks draped, wineskins tucked at their feet, all waiting not for solemn tragedy, but for something far stranger. Comedy. If you think Greek theatre was lofty, noble, and dignified, wait until you meet Aristophanes in the raucous world of phallic processions, bawdy jokes, and political mockery. Tonight you step into festivals where humour was as sacred as sacrifice, and sometimes far cruder than you'd expect from a culture that carved marble gods with perfect symmetry. Greek festivals often blurred lines between reverence and ridicule. Take the Adonia, dedicated to Aphrodite and her lover Adonis. Women gathered on rooftops, planting quick-sprouting gardens in shallow pots, seeds that shot up in days and withered just as quickly. These gardens of Adonis symbolised fleeting beauty and passion, mourned with wails, songs, and theatrical lamentations. Then, just as suddenly, the atmosphere turned bawdy, filled with laughter and innuendo. Death and sex walked hand in hand, wrapped in ritual. Picture rows of women keening dramatically one moment, and then breaking into ribald jokes the next. It was grief turned carnival, as if the only way to mourn was to laugh in the gods' faces. Even more outrageous were the phallophoria, processions where men paraded through the streets carrying oversized phallic symbols. Some were carved from wood, others painted bright red, some tall as lampposts. Accompanied by songs, flutes, and obscene jokes, these parades were meant to honour fertility, ensure harvests, and appease Dionysus, god of wine and revelry. Children stared wide-eyed, elders chuckled, and no one blushed, because for the Greeks, fertility was divine business, and a giant phallus was not indecent but sacred. Imagine your local church service suddenly swapping hymnals for parade floats shaped like body parts. Strange, absolutely, but in Athens it was religion. And then there was comedy itself, especially the biting plays of Aristophanes. His work shocked, delighted, and scandalized Athenians in equal measure. Picture the stage, actors in masks with exaggerated features, costumes padded with grotesque bellies, and yes, comically enormous leather phalluses dangling as props. The audience roared as politicians, philosophers, and even gods were mocked. In the clouds, Socrates was portrayed as a babbling fraud suspended in a basket teaching nonsense. In Lysistrata, women plotted to end war by withholding sex from their husbands, a plot that has echoed through satire ever since. Aristophanes' humour was rarely gentle. He targeted everyone: generals, demagogues, poets, even entire cities. His plays were packed with puns, innuendos, fart jokes, and physical comedy. And yet, beneath the bawdiness lay sharp political critique. He called out corruption, warmongering and hypocrisy, all while making audiences double over in laughter. It was democracy's safety valve, where citizens could ridicule leaders publicly without fear. Imagine if modern parliaments held annual comedy roasts and considered it civic duty to attend. Athens did exactly that, every spring at the Dionysia festival. The theatre itself was enormous, holding thousands. Crowds gathered before dawn, sitting on stone benches as the sun rose. Wine flowed, food was shared, and laughter rolled down the tiers like thunder. Plays often lasted hours, filled with choruses that danced, sang, and hurled insults at the audience. No one was safe. If you were wealthy, powerful, or pompous, Aristophanes would probably have your likeness waddling across the stage in a padded costume mocked mercilessly. Citizens cheered because ridicule was part of civic life. If your reputation couldn't survive a fart joke, perhaps you didn't deserve power. Comedy wasn't the only space for strangeness. Dionysian festivals themselves could dissolve into near madness. Revellers wore masks, drank heavily, sang hymns that turned into bawdy songs. Some processions involved women known as Maenads, devotees of Dionysus, who danced wildly in the hills, hair unbound, clothing torn, carrying Thyrsus wands tipped with ivy. Rumours claimed they tore animals apart with bare hands in ecstatic frenzy, though perhaps that's more myth than fact. Still, the image haunted Greece. Women drunk on divinity, shrieking in the night, embodying both chaos and worship. For Athenians, these displays weren't embarrassing. They were sacred. Laughter, obscenity, even chaos were offerings to the gods. The Greeks believed the divine was not only solemn, but also playful, ribald, unpredictable. To honour Dionysus, you didn't just pour wine, you also cracked jokes, sang dirty songs, and celebrated the raw absurdity of being human. Religion and comedy merged seamlessly. Imagine being told your ticket to the afterlife depended partly on how loudly you laughed at a politician dressed in goatskins. It's strange to think how comfortable the Greeks were with public obscenity. Today, societies often separate the sacred from the bawdy, the temple from the tavern. The Greeks mashed them together gleefully. A festival could include sacrifices in the morning, drinking contests at noon, and phallus parades in the evening. No contradiction. For them, fertility and laughter were as holy as prayer. Aristophanes leaned heavily on this cultural comfort zone. His plays are littered with sexual jokes that modern translators often soften. Yet Athenians laughed heartily, even proudly, at the bluntest humour. They didn't blush at obscenity. They wielded it like a civic tool, stripping away pretense to expose truths. When Aristophanes wrote The Frogs, mocking both dead and living poets, Athenians laughed not just at the silliness, but at the sharpness of critique hidden inside croaks and punchlines. Humour for them wasn't distraction, it was revelation. Still, it must have been bizarre to sit in those audiences. Imagine a solemn citizen, head held high, who yesterday debated justice in the assembly, now cackling as an actor in a leather phallus waddled across the stage. Seriousness and silliness coexisted, both considered vital to civic health. The very same marble benches that echoed with laughter at Aristophanes one day might echo with tears at Sophocles the next. It was all part of the balance, tragedy for catharsis, comedy for ridicule, both for the gods. Even stranger were the phallic hymns, songs sung during festivals that were unabashedly obscene, filled with jokes about body parts, fertility, and desire. Citizens sang them loudly in the streets, children trailing behind, elders joining in. No censorship, no shame. The chorus of laughter itself became a form of offering. If you imagine the gods listening from Olympus, they must have been shaking with mirth. So why did the Greeks embrace such weirdness? Partly because they believed laughter itself had power. It drove away evil, eased tensions and united communities. A city that could laugh together was less likely to tear itself apart. In a way, comedy was another kind of law, binding citizens with humour rather than punishment. Mockery balanced the weight of politics, just as festivals balance the grind of war. Now close your eyes, picture yourself in that theatre, the stone bench hard under you, the smell of wine heavy in the air. On stage, Aristophanes' chorus bursts into bawdy song, actors wave grotesque props, the crowd howls with laughter. You find yourself laughing too, even if the jokes are centuries old, because the absurdity is timeless. A society so brilliant, so disciplined, so ruthless, could also be so gleefully ridiculous. And that, perhaps, is the weirdest thing of all, that Athens, birthplace of philosophy and democracy, was also home to fart jokes and phallus parades, and saw no contradiction in that. The dawn is pale over Epidaurus, a hush falling over marble porticos and courtyards. Pilgrims shuffle quietly into the sanctuary of Asclepius, their sandals scuffing against stone, their eyes heavy with sleepless hope. You smell incense wafting from braziers, sharp pine smoke mingling with herbs crushed in mortar bowls. The temple's priests move deliberately, their white robes whispering as they pass, while sacred snakes slip lazily across the floors. This is no ordinary temple. It is the hospital of ancient Greece, though hospital feels almost too tidy for the strangeness within. Here, illness met ritual, dreams met medicine, and desperation bent itself into faith. If you are sick, this is where you come. Your joints ache, your vision clouds, perhaps a wound festers that no ointment has soothed. You arrive with offerings, a rooster, a handful of coins, sometimes a clay model of the afflicted body part. Piles of terracotta feet, eyes and hands crowd the altars, each one a mute plea. Fix this. The clamour of human need hangs heavier than incense. Around you others wait, men limping, women carrying feverish children, elders trembling with weakness. The sanctuary is filled with their whispers and coughs, a chorus of frailty hoping to be made whole. The ritual begins with purification. You wash in the sacred spring, the water cold and biting. Priests sprinkle barley grains, offer prayers, and sometimes lead sacrifices. Blood spilled to cleanse what herbs cannot. Then comes the heart of the healing, incubation. At dusk you're led into the abaton, a long sleeping hall filled with low benches. The air smells of oil lamps and damp stone. You lie down, clutching your cloak, trying not to notice the serpents sliding silently in the dark. They are sacred to Asclepius, embodiments of renewal, symbols of health shedding sickness like skin. As you drift into uneasy sleep, the murmurs of other patients fade. Soon dreams come. Some dream of the god himself, tall, bearded, radiating calm, touching their wounds. Others dream of snakes coiling around their limbs, licking sores, drawing sickness away. Some see visions of herbs, foods, or exercises. In the morning, priests listen carefully, interpreting the dreams like doctors diagnosing symptoms. The god says you must change your diet. The god commands you to exercise. The god promises healing, but first sacrifice another rooster. Oddly enough, many leave improved. Some heal through sheer chance, others through the psychological power of expectation. The sanctuary, with its rituals, baths and rest, created conditions where bodies could recover naturally. Add the occasional herbal remedy, willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, and miracles weren't so impossible. The inscriptions carved into marble testify, Hermias came blind, but the god healed him. Timarete, barren for years, conceived after incubation. These testimonies piled up, turning Epidaurus into the Mayo Clinic of the ancient world, except with more snakes and fewer insurance forms. But strangeness clings to every detail. Imagine being awakened in the night by the soft slither of scales across your blanket, only to be told it was a blessing, or lying in a row of sick strangers, each groaning, coughing, sweating, and being reassured that gods were among you. The psychological pressure must have been immense, to believe, to hope, to feel healed even when you were not. Faith itself became a form of medicine, one you swallowed nightly with your dreams. Beyond healing, the sanctuary was spectacle. Priests performed dramatic rituals, chanting hymns, parading sacred objects, retelling stories of miraculous cures. Patients weren't just treated, They were enveloped in theatre. The gods were near, the priests insisted, and the evidence lay in every inscription, every healed pilgrim limping out with brighter eyes. Even failure was explained away. Perhaps the patient hadn't purified enough or hadn't believed strongly. The system never faltered, only the humans did. Other sanctuaries added their own quirks. At Pergamon, in Asia Minor, patients sometimes underwent dream incubation in underground tunnels, the air thick and suffocating. At Kos, Hippocrates himself may have studied alongside Asclepian rituals, blending observation with tradition. One moment a priest prescribed herbs, the next a dream promised divine touch. Rational medicine and mystical ritual walked hand in hand, not rivals but companions. The weirdness wasn't limited to healing. Greek festivals dedicated to Asclepius often blurred solemnity with revelry. After rituals, worshippers feasted, drank and sang. Some sanctuaries even doubled as theatres, hosting plays while patients rested nearby. Imagine recovering from illness while an Aristophanic comedy thundered through the air, laughter blending with coughs and prayers. Healing was never purely clinical, it was communal, emotional, and oddly joyful. And yet, you feel the tension. The same culture that demanded logic in philosophy embraced snake-lick cures in religion. The same Athens that birthed geometry sent its sick to dream of divine remedies. To the Greeks, no contradiction existed. Humans were fragile, gods were powerful, and healing belonged as much to ritual as to reason. Now, as the night deepens in your imagination, picture yourself in that abaton. The stone bench presses against your back. Around you, others sigh in sleep, their faces pale. From the shadows, a serpent glides closer, tongue flicking. You shiver, but instead of recoiling you whisper a prayer, "Asclepius, heal me." In the dream that follows, a tall figure appears, hand glowing as it brushes your wound. You awake, heart lighter, pain lessened. Was it real? Was it the mind? In Greece, the answer didn't matter. Healing was healing, wherever it came from. And so the sanctuary continues, its halls echoing with prayers, its walls covered in inscriptions of gratitude, its chambers filled with sleepers hoping for dreams. The gods may be silent now, but their presence once turned illness into ritual, suffering into spectacle, and desperation into hope. As the final torch gutters out in your mind, you let the strangeness settle. A hospital of snakes, dreams as prescriptions, and miracles carved into stone. It is bizarre, it is beautiful, and it is unmistakably Greek.